Hey guys, it's Will, and welcome back to Historical Chess Games. So today we're going to continue our analysis of the chess games of Francois Philidor. And in this game, we see a little time jump from the game that we covered last time, which was played in 1749. This game is from 1780. It was played between a team of two players, Bernard and Carlier, and Philidor. So Philidor is playing against two people. And Philidor has the black pieces in this game. And you might notice something a little bit strange. Philidor is missing his f6 pawn. His f7 pawn. And this is because in old times, if players thought that they were better than someone, they could give them piece odds, which basically means that they would start without that piece. So in this game, Philidor thinks that he is better than the other two chess players combined, and so he gives them pawn odds, which means that he starts without his f7 pawn. Okay, so knowing that, let's get into the game. So white starts off with e4, and Philidor responds with e6, the French defense. This is usually played to defend this weak f7 square that white likes to target, because the only defender to this square is the king. So you see a lot of openings from white's perspective based around attacking that square. Okay, so now we see d4, which is the most common move, taking advantage of the space in the center that black has allowed white to get. And Philidor plays d5, playing in the main line and challenging white's center control. We see e takes d5 and e takes d5, the exchange variation. And once again, if you guys want me to cover these openings in a little more depth, just tell me in the comments and I'll make some videos analyzing them. Now we see queen h5 check, which I don't think is great. You usually don't want to bring out your queen so early, and Philidor can just play g6, which he does, forcing the queen back and blocking the check. So now we see queen e5 check, which is checking the king here and attacking the rook. Oh. There we go. But Philidor can stop this by just simply playing queen e7, which stops the attack because it pins white's queen to his king, so he can't move it because then his king would be in check. We see bishop f4, and we see c6, protecting the e-pawn. So now we see bishop e2, which stops this pin. And we see bishop g7, which is attacking this queen and at the same time skewering the d-pawn. The queens now come off the board. We see queen exchange, queen takes e7 check, and knight recaptures. And now we see knight f3, which is protecting the pawn here, and at the same time preparing to castle. We see Philidor castle, which gets the king out of the center, and at the same time initiates an attack on the bishop with the rook. And now we see bishop e5, which is offering an exchange of the bishops. And now we see knight d7, which does develop a piece, but at the same time, it also blocks in Philidor's light square bishop. So you gain some and you lose some. White castles here, and here I think that white probably should have captured the bishop on g7, which would force Philidor to recapture with his king and expose the king a little bit. Also, when you're up in a material, remember that white is up a pawn since Philidor started down a pawn. It's always a good idea to exchange and simplify the game, because then you can expand on your advantage more easily and convert. But they do decide to castle, and Philidor gains the bishop pair by taking the exchange. Knight takes e5. We see white recapture. Knight takes e5. And I think this just isn't great because Philidor can play c5, which would be really bad for white. Philidor actually plays bishop takes e5, which I think isn't too good because it just gives up the advantage that he just gained by getting the bishop pair. But let's see what would have happened if he'd played c5. So if we go back to this position and he plays c5 here, white cannot take d takes c5 because then his knight would just simply be hanging to this bishop. He needs this pawn to defend the knight. So since this pawn is being threatened by the c5 pawn, he needs to play something to defend that pawn, probably like c3. And after c takes d4, c takes d4, black can just simply play knight c6, which overwhelms this pawn. So in this situation, we could see the knight capture here, and in that situation, we could see the bishop capture here, and then you could say, hey, well, can't white just simply then move his knight away and regain the piece? But actually not, because if you look at it, once the knight is moved here and the bishop captures here, the bishop is threatening this pawn, which would be attacking the rook. So white doesn't want to get himself into that sort of position. So white could play something like rook d1, which defends this pawn. But then black can just take knight takes d4, because after white takes, it looks like black has gone down a piece, but then we have, remember this move, bishop takes e5, which regains the knight, and black has gained a pawn, because remember, Philidor captured the pawn on the first move. So now we've regained our material, and we're attacking this rook. We're attacking this rook, and at the same time, we're skewering this b2 pawn. So white is forced to play rook d2, protecting this pawn and getting his rook out of danger. And if you look at this position, we can see that black is much better for several reasons. Firstly, he has this d5 center pawn, which is a pass pawn. Secondly, he has the bishop pair, which is super useful in open games where there's not a lot of material clogging up the center, so he can control large areas of the board. And thirdly, his bishop on e5 is super active, and since white had to waste this move, rook d2, to defend this pawn that we skewered, we can just develop our light square bishop, maybe bishop e6, getting into the action, planning on connecting our rooks here, and we see that white's passive position with his pieces basically doing nothing back here is far inferior to black's position. Now that Philidor would have equalized, we can see that this would be a very good game for black. So that's why I'm making the case for c5 here. But unfortunately, Philidor does play bishop takes e5, which I don't think is that good. This was a huge opportunity for Philidor to really take control of the game, gain back his material, gain some initiative, but instead he just allows white to stay with the initiative by trading away his bishop, losing the bishop pair, losing any chance of possible attacks he might have had. Okay, so now we see d takes e5, and we see rook f4, which I don't think does that much. I think that Philidor could be aiming for rook e4, which would be attacking the bishop and at the same time attacking the e pawn. But I think that if he would have played something more like rook f5, it would have been better, because it gives Philidor the option of attacking this e pawn in just one move, instead of having to waste 2 moves of coming up here first and then coming over here. So now we also see bishop d3, which is covering this e4 square. So any plans that Philidor have of bringing his rook here to attack this pawn are instantly squashed. We see bishop f5, which is offering to trade off the bishops. And white accepts the exchange. He takes with the bishop. Bishop takes f5. And Philidor recaptures with his knight. And this, I just think, is another mistake. So now that his knight is on this f5 square, it blocks his rook off from retreating. And also, if you think about it, if he had recaptured with his rook, he immediately initiates an attack on this e-pawn. So it's just, a far more aggressive position. I understand that he most likely wanted to get his knight more into the game, but I think that capturing with his rook would have been a much better option. So now we see g3, which pushes the rook away. And since the rook cannot come back, he goes to e4, which is threatening this e5 pawn. We see f4, which protects this pawn, and it also forms this very strong kingside pawn chain. So we see that white looks good here. Now we see rook e2, which is attacking the c2 pawn. And we see knight a3, protecting the pawn. And we see knight e3, which isn't great again, because here white plays this excellent move, rook f2. And since this knight here is cutting off the rook's escape, we can see that the rook does not have any safe squares really to go to, because anywhere it moves here on this rank, it will be captured by the rook, and if it tries to move down to the first rank, it will just be captured by the other rook. So here Philidor has really boxed himself into a position where he's forced to trade, and as we said before, when you're down material, trading is always going to benefit the person that's up material. So I think that moving his knight to e3 wasn't so good, because now white plays this move f2, which kind of forces Philidor to trade. So he does trade, and now when the king recaptures, it recaptures with tempo, because it's also kicking this knight off this square and getting the king involved into the action. We see knight g4 check, and we see king g2. Now rook d8, which is planning on forcing his pawn through on this open file. And we see h3, attacking the knight. And now we see knight h6. And Philidor's knight is just in a bad spot. It's not really doing anything here. So we can see that white is in a much better position, much more aggressive position with this kingside initiative here that he's planning on just sort of pushing forward, maybe getting his rook involved, king marching up, maybe redeveloping his knight. Sorry, not there, but redeveloping his knight to this side. So we can see that here white is just in a much better position. Okay, so here we see g4, and we see a6. See rook d1, adding some pressure onto this d5 pawn. And we see knight f7, just trying to reposition. We see h4, and now we can tell that white is really trying to push his kingside pawn storm. And we see c5 from Philidor, just desperately trying to achieve some counterplay. But I think that Philidor really should try some sort of defensive maneuver on the king side, because he just won't have enough time to generate a decent queenside attack before white's pawns just steamroll his entire position, and he's forced to either give up a poor exchange or allow white to promote. We see c3, which opens up this c2 square for the knight to reposition itself and add pressure onto this pawn. So we can see that that's white's plan. That's their plan here. And now we see b5, which again I don't think is that good. We see the knight come to c2 as we were expecting. We see a5, and Philidor's position is just not very impressive. These sort of pawns aren't really going to do anything here before white just overwhelms him. So now we see the knight come to e3, as we were expecting before, and we see d4, pressuring this knight. But now the knight can sort of move around, chase the pawn, and try to win this piece, since we will have both the rook and the knight covering this pawn at the same time. But before we see the knight start chasing around this pawn, we see white make a exchange. C takes d4, c takes d4, once again simplifying the game, moving towards the endgame in which white will be the favorite. And now white can really start harassing this d pawn here. So he plays knight c2, attacking the pawn. And we see, once again, Philidor march up, attacking this knight. But now we see knight e1, which is continuing to attack this pawn. So Philidor, once again, plays his only option, d2, attacking the knight once again. But now, knight f3, attacking the pawn, and Philidor resigns in this position. He knows that this d-pawn is going to fall, and he's going to be down 2 pawns since he was never able to regain his material because he had already given his opponents pawn-ons. He knows that being down 2 pawns, there's no way he can defend against white just simply marching his king up the board and smashing through any defense black might have by just ramming his pawns through. So this was a very good game, and unfortunately Philidor came away the loser, but he did play against 2 players, and at the same time he started down a pawn, so I'd say it's not too bad from his perspective. Hopefully you enjoyed the game, and I'll be back with more historical games soon. Thanks for watching.